So here's a huge question. Who controls the border? Is it all up to the federal government in Washington, D.C., or can a single state just take matters into its own hands? We're about to dive into a massive legal showdown that went all the way to the Supreme Court, a case that pitted the power of a state against the authority of the entire nation. And that's really the core question here, the one at the very heart of this landmark case, Arizona versus United States. It makes you wonder, what happens when a state feels like the federal government just isn't doing its job to protect the border? Can it step in and start making its own rules? The answer to that would really define the balance of power in America for a long, long time. So, how did this whole thing even start? Well, this was not some abstract legal debate cooked up in a classroom. Nope. This started on the ground, in Arizona, with a really controversial new law that was basically born out of pure frustration. Okay, so back in 2010, Arizona passed this sweeping law called SB 1070. A huge part of it made it a state crime to be in Arizona without carrying your federal registration papers. But it didn't stop there. It also made it illegal for an undocumented person to even look for work, and it required police to check the immigration status of anyone they stopped if they had what they called reasonable suspicion. So, what was Arizona's side of the story? For them, it was simple. They were in a crisis. The state argued that they were dealing with, and I'm quoting here, an epidemic of crime, safety risks, and serious property damage, which they said all came from illegal immigration. From their point of view, the federal government had totally failed to secure the border, so the state really had no choice but to step up and defend itself. Yeah, well, the U.S. government saw things completely differently. They actually sued Arizona, arguing the state had gone way, way over the line. And this brings us to the first major argument in this whole judicial duel, the case for exclusive federal power. Justice Anthony Kennedy, who wrote for the court's majority, pretty much laid it all out with this powerful statement. He basically said, look, the power to control immigration is fundamentally a national one. And why does that matter? Because how we treat people from other countries has consequences for the entire nation, affecting everything from our foreign policy to international trade. The legal weapon the federal government used here is a concept called preemption. And the easiest way to think about it is like this. If the Constitution gives Congress the power to regulate something, and Congress goes and creates a whole complex system of laws to do it, it has occupied the field. It's like they've planted their flag and there's just no room left for states to come in and create their own competing rules. Federal law is supreme. End of story. So at its core, Kennedy's argument was that immigration just isn't a local issue. You can't have 50 different states with 50 different immigration policies. I mean, that would be chaos, right? It would completely undermine America's ability to speak with one single voice on the world stage. He said Congress had already built this whole comprehensive system to manage immigration, and Arizona's law was just throwing a giant wrench in the works. But hold on, that's just one side of the coin. Because in a fiery dissent, Justice Antonin Scalia came out with this incredibly powerful counterargument. He defended a state's right to protect itself and laid out a totally different vision of how the Constitution works. And this quote right here, this gets to the absolute heart of the dissent. For Justice Scalia, states aren't just, administrative departments of the federal government. They are sovereigns. He argued by before the Constitution was even a thing, each state had the built-in, inherent power to decide who could and could not cross its borders. This whole idea is called state sovereignty, and the thinking is pretty straightforward. States get to keep all the powers that they didn't explicitly hand over to the federal government. And for Scalia, that absolutely included the most fundamental right of all, the right of self-preservation, the power to protect your people and your land from what you see as a threat. Scalia's point was that Arizona wasn't trying to invent a new immigration system from scratch. He saw SB 1070 as the state just trying to cooperate with and enforce the federal laws that were already on the books. He argued that just because the federal government decides not to enforce its own laws, that doesn't just magically strip a sovereign state of its power to protect its own citizens. So there you have it. The two philosophies are on a total collision course. On one side, you've got federal supremacy, this idea of a unified system where the nation has to speak with one voice. And on the other, you've got state sovereignty, where states have an inherent right to self-defense and can cooperate in enforcing the law. These are two completely different visions of America, and this case brought them head to head. So, after all the arguments, all the debate, where did the Supreme Court actually land? Who won this constitutional showdown? All right, so the verdict was a major win for the federal government, but it wasn't a total knockout.
The court struck down 3 of the 4 big provisions. So it was no longer a state crime to not carry immigration papers or for an undocumented person to look for a job. And police couldn't just arrest someone without a warrant because they thought they might be deportable. But, and this is a big but, the court did allow the most controversial part to stand, at least for the time being, that show me your papers provision.
So why did they strike those parts down? Well, it all comes back to that word we talked about, preemption. The majority, led by Justice Kennedy, basically concluded that Arizona was trying to create its own parallel immigration policy, and that was directly interfering with a very comprehensive system that Congress had already built. So you'd think that would be the end of the story, right? Case closed. But not so fast. Even with this verdict, the case left this massive question just hanging in the air. It settled the fate of Arizona's specific law, but it did nothing to resolve the deep-seated tension that created it in the first place. And that is the question we are still wrestling with today, one that's fueling intense debates all across the country. The Supreme Court drew a line in the sand in Arizona, the United States. But that fundamental conflict, over sovereignty, over security, over the very nature of our federal system, is so far from over. It forces all of us to ask, when there's a crisis at the border, who is ultimately in charge?